All right, welcome to Old Testament Survey, everybody, and to this first teaching video. I'm excited to get into this course with you and study it together, and I hope you're excited to get into the Old Testament too. And maybe you're thinking and hoping that the Old Testament is going to be, beneficial to you in your life and your ministry as you follow Jesus Christ, as you try to communicate the gospel. And I think it can be, and it will be. But honestly, when we start a study of the Old Testament, we're immediately confronted with a problem. That's right, there's a problem. Obviously, non-Christians look at the Bible and the Old Testament and they don't think it's very relevant. They don't think it's very useful for modern people. It's just full of all myths and stories. But there are also many Christians, people who go to church every week, who look at the Old Testament and they see a problem as well, because they don't think that the Old Testament is really relevant for Christian ministry. It's not really useful as in terms of being a disciple and following Jesus. And so they wonder about the Old Testament and they think about it as a problem. And maybe you thought that way too. Maybe you know that the Bible is ultimately about Jesus, and so you opened up the Bible and started to read at the beginning in the Old Testament. You kind of poked around, hoping that it would be useful and beneficial to your Christian life. And then you got to Leviticus and found that it was just boring and seemed irrelevant. And that the events and the places and the characters just seemed kind of disconnected. And the Old Testament is just really long. And so you just kind of lost heart and you just quit reading the Old Testament. So it's a problem that obviously non-Christians have, but even a lot of Christians view the Old Testament as just not being very relevant to contemporary life and ministry. Well, what are some of the problems that people have with the Old Testament? Well, number one, they think that the Old Testament is outdated. It's just really old. Well, how old is the Old Testament? Well, in many cases, the books of the Old Testament were written over 2,000 years ago, in some cases 3,000 years ago. And so people look at books like that and they think, well, how can the Old Testament speak to contemporary culture when it was written so long ago? It's just outdated. The laws are outdated. The material is from a different time and a different place. It can't possibly be relevant to people living in the 21st century. And so they say that the Old Testament is just outdated. Another problem that people have with the Old Testament is that it has a lot of strange customs. When you begin to read the Old Testament, there are just all kinds of weird things that you come across. There are clean laws and unclean laws. There are, just the prophets doing weird things. There are just things that people do from a different time and a different culture, and the Old Testament seems like it relates to a whole different world. It's just so strange. Another problem people have with the Old Testament are some of the moral difficulties that we have. When you look at some of the heroes in the Old Testament, people like David and Abraham and Moses, they don't seem very heroic, and they get involved in moral difficulties like adultery and murder, and they express anger. How can they be held up as examples for contemporary people? And then there's the issue of polygamy. When you read the Old Testament, many of the characters have more than one wife, and we look at that and we go, well, is that okay? Does God allow that? Is that God's design for marriage? Was that something that related to that time, or is it still relevant today? And then maybe the biggest moral difficulty of all is when you read the books of Joshua and Judges, and the people of Israel are going into the promised land. God tells them when they go in there, they're supposed to kill everybody, men, women, animals, and just take over. Now, that doesn't seem like a very sensitive evangelism strategy, that you just kill people that disagree with you. So how do we think about all of these moral difficulties that we find in the Old Testament? Another problem that people see with the Old Testament is that it's exclusively about the Jews. It seems to be just a Jewish story. It's about the history of Israel. And after all, most of us are not Jewish. We're Gentiles. And, we look at the story of salvation, and it seems to only open up to the Gentiles when we get to the New Testament and the Apostle Paul and the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. So the Old Testament might be interesting if you're interested in Israelite history, but how is it relevant to Christians and Gentiles? It all seems so Jewish. And then finally, a problem with the Old Testament is that it seems to be all about law and not grace. There are so many laws in the Old Testament, and it seems like that God is saying that in the Old Testament, in order to be saved, you got to keep all those laws. And that's almost impossible for anybody to do. And so when you read the Old Testament, God seems to be so judgmental and angry, and he's always punishing people for not living up to those laws and keeping them. Doesn't seem to be the God of grace and kindness that we meet in the New Testament, and especially in Jesus Christ. So how are we supposed to think about the Old Testament for a Christian life, for living a life of discipleship and following Jesus? How are we supposed to benefit and use the Old Testament in Christian ministry? Well, these are problems. Well, they're not really problems because none of these are really true. And so we're going to spend the rest of the course talking about God's one story of redemption that begins in the Old Testament, that begins with his grace, that ultimately climaxes in Jesus Christ. So the Old Testament really can be useful and beneficial for Christians, but we have to overcome the problems that many people have with it.